Any hospital that wishes to perform a transplant must adhere to these specifications. But for the first transplant, it was the Tinganu CHU that was chosen by the authorities. So, that's how things happened. And that's why we were able to perform the first transplant in our country on July 29th.
On the morning of July 29, 2025, a Burkina surgeon stood over the open abdomen of a young woman inside Tengondogo University Hospital in Ouagadougou. His hands steady, his team silent, his mission national. What they did next wasn't permitted by Paris, taught by Tunisia, or outsourced to India. They transplanted a kidney, and they did it on Burkina soil, with Burkina mines under the Burkina state. This was not a first, this was a rupture. Because for decades, the phrase advanced medicine meant boarding a plane. It meant passports, euro-priced diagnostics, and the humiliation of leaving one's own country just to survive. But under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traore, that cycle broke. He didn't just dream of independence, he operationalized it. Traore made medical sovereignty a military priority. He invested in hospitals not as charities, but as fortresses. And that's how, on that day, when a woman's twin sister gave her the gift of life, it didn't happen in a foreign operating room. It happened here. In the heart of a nation once told it wasn't advanced enough to save its own people. This wasn't a transplant. This was a severing, a cut in the empire's surgical leash. The doctors, fully Burkina, moved like strategists. They didn't just restore a kidney, they restored belief. And when the procedure ended, the room didn't erupt into celebration. It sank into something deeper, a knowing the era of exporting our sick is over. Because in this new war for African life, the scalpel belongs to us now, and no flag waves over the operating table that doesn't belong to the people. Before we cut deeper, like and subscribe if you believe healing is rebellion. But once you name the hospital where it happened, you realize the flag on the roof is no longer white. For too long, survival came with a stamp. Not the red one that confirms you were cured, but the blue one that says you were allowed to leave. For decades, when Burkina bodies broke, they were quietly exiled. Not by force, but by structure. Because hospitals here weren't allowed to heal completely. They were allowed to stabilize, to manage, to wait. But when it came time to operate to save, they deferred. Always upward. Always outward. The rich flew to Morocco, to France, to Switzerland. The poor died at home. That wasn't just inequality. That was colonial medical hierarchy, rebranded as lack of development. It wasn't that we didn't have brains. It's that we weren't meant to believe in them. Every visa request to treat cancer, every government convoy flying a minister to Europe for checkups. Every medical tourism billboard whispering that black life must leave black land to stay alive. It was never about health. It was about belief. Belief that Africa was permanently in medical kindergarten. Belief that modern healing had a passport. Belief that sovereignty stopped at the hospital gate. And behind that belief stood an architecture. Equipment contracts rigged by foreign suppliers. Training programs managed by donor politics. Doctors trained to assist, not lead. Even the vocabulary betrayed us. Referral hospital became code for stop here, but go elsewhere if you want to live. Entire ministries of health were structured like diplomatic desks, begging for partnerships instead of building internal command. But under the surface, something was brewing. There were surgeons trained in silence, nurses practicing under low light, patients asking, why not here? The wound was open, and eventually a scalpel would arrive, not from abroad, from within. Because a nation that exports its sick does more than lose bodies. It exports dignity, and dignity doesn't come back on a plane. It returns through infrastructure, belief, and one act of surgical rebellion at a time. And just before this surgical rebellion, our last breath still depended on foreign permission. It wasn't loud. There were no press cameras inside the operating room, No Western NGOs handing out credit. No French health attaché clapping from the corner. Just silence and precision. The patient lay still beneath the surgical lights, wrapped in the sterile hum of focused defiance. Her sister had already given the kidney, voluntarily, lovingly, and above all, locally, a match not just of blood, but of ideology. 2 Burkina women, refusing exile. And then came the moment. A team of surgeons, trained in country, disciplined in silence, ignored for years, made the incision, not just into flesh, but into history. They navigated arteries, calmed the immune system, aligned vessels like strategists studying terrain. Every stitch, a statement. Every tool sterilized in a facility the world pretended didn't exist. And they did it all inside Tengandogo University Hospital, in Ouagadougou, not Geneva, not Rabat, not Paris. They worked like it was war. Because it was. For decades, Africa's hospitals were called under-equipped. But this wasn't about equipment. It was about permission. Permission to trust our own training. Permission to risk excellence. Permission to stop asking. And on that table, for the first time in Burkina surgical history, permission was revoked. Dependency was severed. A body that would have once flown to France stayed and lived. There was no standing ovation. There was quiet reverence. The lead surgeon didn't call attention to himself. He called attention to the future. He understood what had just shifted. This wasn't just medicine. This was an inauguration. An entire generation of doctors, nurses, and medical students now knew the highest form of healing didn't require escape. It required belief. And the patient, she woke up, in her own country, breathing, restored, home. But what made this possible wasn't just the hands that cut. It was the system behind them. Tengandogo University Hospital was never meant to be a fortress. It was built with foreign expectations. Its halls designed to look modern, while its sovereignty was quietly leased out to technical partners and foreign consultants. It wore the mask of progress, but carried the leash of dependency. But that mask has been burned. Because under Captain Ibrahim Traore's leadership, the hospital was repurposed. Not cosmetically, structurally. The kidney transplant that shocked the Western world didn't happen in a vacuum. It emerged from a state-backed transformation of the national health complex. What used to be a passive referral site became an active theater of sovereignty. The difference: command and investment. Instead of waiting for permission, the Burkina state began installing capability. Not in headlines, in hardware, not in charity reports. In sterilized wards, blood analysis labs, and immunology departments calibrated for serious work. Government directives prioritized local surgical training pipelines. Medical universities were instructed to train not just assistants, but leaders. The Ministry of Health, restructured under nationalist orientation, stopped chasing grants and started demanding results. And beneath that ideological shield, institutions like Tengandogo were re-armed. New equipment was procured through non-Western partnerships, tools not just for diagnosis, but for intervention. And more importantly, staff retention was nationalized. Doctors who once emigrated to Europe were returning, not for nostalgia, but because the battlefield was ready. That's what makes a hospital a fortress, not its size. Its function as sovereign ground. Every oar became a war room. Every scrubbed, in specialist a soldier of life. Every nurse a frontline sentry in the war against imposed fragility. And it worked. Because when that kidney was placed inside the recipient, the hospital didn't flinch. It absorbed the risk. It delivered the victory. And it kept moving forward. This wasn't a miracle. It was preparedness. Because sovereignty is not declared by speeches. It is executed by systems. And when you see what they built beneath the surface, you realize this wasn't a hospital. It was a declaration of independence. There's a reason it took this long. Not because Burkina Faso lacked the minds. Not because Ouagadougou lacked the will. But because for decades, Africa's ability to heal itself was sabotaged by design. This was never about medical development. It was about medical containment. Across the continent, Western pharmaceutical lobbies ensured that patents remained locked. Surgical tools were sold at inflated prices. Basic reagents, saline bags, immunosuppressants, sterilization fluids were choked at border points unless routed through approved procurement systems tied to former colonial states. The empire didn't say, "Don't heal yourselves." It said, "Heal yourselves." But only with what we approve, from who we approve, and when we approve it. Every time an African nation tried to manufacture its own antibiotics, regulations emerged. Every time an African hospital sought to buy imaging machines from non-Western sources, pressure mounted. Every time a state threatened to bypass French or American equipment pipelines, a funding threat followed. Behind the stethoscopes were surveillance cables. Behind the aid were algorithms of dependency. In Burkina Faso, these blockades weren't theory. They were the daily humiliation of watching expired Western drugs arrive as donations, while young chemists were denied raw material to produce local equivalents. And in hospitals like Tengandogo, even acquiring replacement parts for essential surgical machines required navigating through layers of French, coded bureaucracy and IMF-approved vendors. Meanwhile, NGOs became quiet sentries of control. They offered training, programs that produced more dependents than leaders. They installed diagnostic labs that could never be upgraded without foreign tech support. They praised collaboration, while ensuring that no African surgeon ever took the global podium alone. And when whispers of independence emerged, when African doctors began discussing full transplant teams or local pharmaceutical manufacturing, they were called reckless. They were warned about safety, scalability, ethics, not because they were wrong, but because they were right and ready. That's what bio-colonialism looks like. It's not about withholding care. It's about ensuring that care can only move through their hands, their terms, and their optics. And this is why that transplant mattered. Not only because it saved a life, but because it cut through the blockade. It said, we don't need approval to be excellent. We don't need supervision to be sovereign. And we will no longer wait for permission to protect our own. Because buried beneath every syringe they denied us was a doctrine they feared we'd resurrect. This was never just a kidney. It was a code, written in flesh and blood. And when it was transplanted inside a Burkinabe body, by Burkinabe hands, inside a Burkinabe hospital, something ancient and buried stood back up. The message was simple: Africa doesn't need to beg for breath. Africa can breathe on its own terms. Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't just praise the transplant as a medical achievement. He framed it as proof of a vision he's enforced since seizing power. The vision that true independence means full biological sovereignty, not just borders, not just weapons, but the ability to heal your own people without asking the empire for a syringe. And now that proof lives inside a woman who might have once died waiting for a visa. Now she lives because Burkina Faso stopped waiting. This moment cannot stay isolated. If one hospital can do it, so can 5. If 5 doctors can lead, so can 1,000 students. If one country can stand, the bloc can rise. Because healing is no longer a humanitarian concept, it's an ideological weapon. Surgical teams are now strategists. Hospitals are now sovereign outposts. Medical schools are now political academies. And patients, they are no longer weak bodies in need of rescue. They are national terrain, sacred, defended, untouchable. Let the West be shocked. Let their embassies send quiet reports. Let their NGOs scramble for relevance. Because Burkina Faso just proved what they feared most, that Africa's body was never broken, just interrupted. And now, we are stitching it back together. One organ, one operating table. One unlicensed act of sovereignty at a time. Comment, which hospital should we weaponize next? Share if you believe no African should leave home to survive. Subscribe. Because the cure was never overseas. It was always in our blood. And the next transplant may not just be an organ. It might be a whole generation of belief. We are not asking to survive. We are now trained to save ourselves.